Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku became a Soul Reaper in the Bleach universe. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The world, for Izuku Midoriya, had always been a crowded place. It wasn't just the living who filled the streets of Muzurifu, a city that hummed with a restless, unseen energy. It was the others, the silent, translucent figures who lingered at street corners, forever reenacting the last moments of a life cut short. The forlorn woman in the faded blue sundress who waited at the bus stop, her form flickering with every passing vehicle, still waiting for a ride that would never come. The little boy with the red ball who chased it into the street near the park, his spectral form phasing through cars as he did so, a sad, endless loop of play. These were the pluses. The lingering souls of the dead, chained to the world by regret, love, or simple confusion. Izuku had seen them for as long as he could remember. When he was a small child, he tried to talk to them, earning him worried looks from his mother and the scorn of other children. He quickly learned that he was the only one who saw the second layer of reality draped over the first. He was an anomaly. In a world where 80% of the population was born with a quirk, a unique superhuman ability, Izuku Midoriya was born with nothing. No telekinesis, no super strength, no ability to generate fire or ice. The doctor's diagnosis had been a crushing blow, a death sentence to his dreams. But his quirklessness was a lie of a sort. He possessed no physical power, but his soul was a wide-open window to a world no one else could perceive. He had immense spiritual awareness, a curse disguised as a deficiency. This awareness meant he didn't just see the sad, harmless pluses. He also saw the things that hunted them. They were monstrous, twisted things of black and white, their faces hidden behind grotesque bone masks. Each was a perversion of a soul, a nightmare given form. He didn't know their official name, but in the privacy of his own mind, he called them devourers. They were predators, drawn to the spiritually rich and the emotionally vulnerable, and their presence felt like a patch of ice forming on his skin, a static hum at the edge of hearing that promised only oblivion. And then there were the others. His true obsession. The reason for the 13 meticulously detailed notebooks stacked on his shelf. He called them the Guardians. They moved like ghosts themselves, clad in the blackest of kimonos, a shihakusho he'd learned from a historical textile book, and carrying the one thing that seemed to harm the devourers: swords. Katanas, zanpakuto. He'd scribbled down every name he'd ever heard one of them mutter. They were saviors who fought a secret, silent war in the alleys and on the rooftops of his city. They were the true heroes, unseen and unsung. They were soul reapers. Midoriya, the voice, dry and bored, sliced through his concentration. Izuku flinched, his pencil skittering across the page of Guardian Analysis for the Future, Volume 13. He was in his last period class, history, and had been so engrossed in sketching the Kido spell he'd witnessed a Soul Reaper use last week, a burst of white light that had bound a devourer in place, that he hadn't noticed the teacher looming over his desk. "While I'm sure your artistic pursuits are very important," Mr. Aizawa said, his voice dripping with its usual brand of tired sarcasm, "they bear little relevance to the Meiji Restoration. Pay attention." A snicker rippled through the classroom. Izuku's face burned hot with shame. He muttered "Sorry, sensei," and quickly shoved the notebook into his bag. From 2 seats over, a pair of crimson eyes narrowed at him, boring into the side of his head with an almost physical force. Katsuki Bakugo. Bakugo was complicated. He was born with a powerful quirk that let him secrete nitroglycerin like sweat and detonate it, creating massive explosions. He was brilliant, athletic, and destined for greatness at a top hero academy like UA High. But there was a strange, ever-present tension coiled in him, a hair-trigger temper that seemed to flare at things no one else noticed. Izuku knew why. Bakugo couldn't see the other world, but he could feel it. Izuku had seen it in the way Bakugo would sometimes flinch when a plus drifted too close, or how his eyes would dart to a corner of the room where the spiritual pressure was thick and heavy. He was like a man standing in a pitch-black room, sensing movement all around him but unable to see the source. It made him perpetually furious, and that fury was often directed at the one person who seemed to be staring right at the invisible threats, Izuku. The final bell shrieked, a welcome release. As students began packing their bags, Bakugo was on his feet in an instant, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He stomped over to Izuku's desk and slammed his palms down on it, making Izuku jump. Still drawing your creepy little comic book characters, Deku? Bakugo sneered, his voice a low growl. His gaze flickered around Izuku, as if searching for whatever had held his attention. What the hell are you always looking at? There's nothing there, you useless bastard. Stop staring into space like a freak. It's nothing, Kaken, Izuku stammered, shrinking in his seat. He couldn't explain. How could he? It's just a hobby. A creepy hobby, Bakugo shot back, smoke beginning to trail from his palms. It's like you're listening to something no one else can hear. It pisses me off. Stop it. With a final, contemptuous glare, he turned and stalked out of the room, leaving Izuku trembling slightly. He wasn't wrong. Izuku was listening to something no one else could hear, the faint, sorrowful whispers of the dead and the predatory chittering of the monsters that hunted them. He packed his bag, the familiar weight of helplessness settling over his shoulders. What good was seeing all of this if he couldn't do anything? He was a spectator in a war for the souls of his city, a powerless witness to both tragedy and heroism. Every time he saw a Soul Reaper in action, a painful mix of awe and despair churned in his gut. He wanted, more than anything in the world, to be like them. To stand between the innocent and the monstrous. To protect. To be a hero. But heroes had power. Izuku Midoriya had nothing but clear eyes and a racing heart. The walk home took him under a familiar, grime-stained underpass. The air here was always cooler, the concrete walls amplifying the drip-drip-drip of water from some unseen pipe. It was a place where shadows clung stubbornly even at midday, and it was a hotbed of spiritual residue. A sad-eyed salaryman plus often stood by the far wall, staring at a stain on the concrete that, to Izuku's eyes, held the faint, dark outline of a long clean blood splatter. Today, the salaryman wasn't there. The air was different. It was heavy, charged with a cloying sweetness like rotting fruit and the sharp tang of ozone. It was a scent Izuku had come to associate with only one thing: a devourer was near. A hollow. His heart hammered against his ribs. His training, honed over years of terrified observation, kicked in. Make yourself small. Dampen your presence. Don't show fear. Hollows were drawn to souls with high spiritual energy, and fear, he noticed, seemed to make a soul brighter to their senses. He hunched his shoulders, pulling his spiritual presence inward as best he could, a trick he'd learned that was more of a mental placebo than an actual technique. He quickened his pace, his yellow backpack bouncing uncomfortably. He just had to get through the underpass, back into the open, sunlit street. That's when he heard the whimper. It was faint, terrified. He stopped, straining his ears over the sound of his own blood rushing. It came from a narrow service alley that branched off from the underpass. Against every instinct screaming at him to flee, Izuku found his feet carrying him toward the sound. He peered around the corner. His blood ran cold. Tsubasa, one of his classmates, a quiet boy with a minor quirk that gave him small, feathered wings, was backed against the brick wall. He was shaking, tears streaming down his face, though his eyes were wide with confusion, not terror. He couldn't see what was in front of him, but Izuku could. It was a monstrosity that looked like a praying mantis fused with a human skeleton. Its body was long and spindly, covered in a bone-white carapace. Two scythe-like arms, serrated and dripping with a black ichor, were held aloft, poised to strike. But the worst part was its mask. It was a blank, white plate of bone, with only a jagged, gaping hole where its heart should be and a series of thin, horizontal slits for a mouth, curled into a permanent, silent grin of pure malice. It was toying with its food, savoring the boy's fear, which it was drinking in like a fine wine. Izuku was frozen. This was the nightmare scenario he'd played out in his head 1,000 times. A person in danger. A hollow. And him, utterly, pathetically, uselessly, there. Run, his brain screamed. Get help. Find a guardian. But there was no one. No black-clad figure on the rooftops. No telltale flicker of a flash step. It was just him. Tsubasa's whimpers grew louder as the temperature around him plummeted. He was starting to feel the hollow's presence, the life-draining cold that preceded an attack. The hollow raised one of its side-like arms. The air crackled. In that split second, Izuku's analysis-addicted brain went into overdrive, cataloging the scene with a frantic, detached horror. Target, Tsubasa. Threat, mid-level insect-type hollow. Weak point, mask. Available assets, 0. Power level, 0. Probability of survival. The calculation was so grim it shocked his system into action. The part of him that dreamed of being a hero, the small, defiant flame that had refused to be extinguished by a decade of mockery and powerlessness, flared to life. It was a suicidal, idiotic, and utterly involuntary response. Hey! Get away from him! The shout tore from his throat, raw and desperate. He didn't even realize he moved until his yellow backpack was sailing through the air, a pathetic, clumsy projectile. The bag flew straight through the hollow's ethereal head, doing absolutely nothing. But the sound, the raw, defiant intent in Izuku's voice, was enough. The monster's head snapped toward him, the empty slits of its mask fixed on this new, much brighter burning soul. It had been savoring an appetizer. Now, the main course had announced itself. It forgot Tsubasa completely. With a sickening, chitinous click, it turned its full attention to Izuku. Oh no! Fear, cold and absolute, seized him. His legs felt like they were bolted to the concrete. The hollow took a step, then another, its movements jerky and unnatural. It was slow, confident. It knew its prey was trapped. Tsubasa, freed from the oppressive spiritual pressure, didn't waste a second. He scrambled to his feet and ran, not even looking back. He hadn't seen the monster, only felt a sudden, terrifying chill, and now, the weird kid from his class screaming at an empty alley. He was gone. Izuku was glad. At least Tsubasa was safe. The thought was a small comfort as he faced the certainty of his own death. The hollow was 10 feet away. Then 5. He could smell the decay now, feel the soul-sucking cold radiating from its body. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable. Swish. The sound was a clean, sharp whisper of steel through the air. It was followed by a wet, tearing noise and a deafening shriek that wasn't physical, but psychical, a scream that echoed directly in Izuku's soul. He dared to open his eyes. A man stood between him and the creature. He was tall, dressed in the familiar black shahakusho of a soul reaper. His back was to Izuku. He had spiky, dark brown hair with a single, distinguished streak of gray near his temple, and he held a katana with a simple, unadorned square tsuba. The hollow was bisected from its shoulder to its waist. The two halves of its body were already dissolving into glowing blue particles, its agonized shriek fading as it disintegrated. With a final, practiced flick of his blade to shed the spiritual residue, the Soul Reaper sheathed his zanpakuto. He let out a long, weary sigh, the sound of a man who had done this 1,000,000 times and would do it 1,000,000 more. Then he turned. His face was sharp, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw, but his eyes were tired. They were the eyes of a soldier who had seen too many battles. A jagged scar ran vertically over his left eye, which was a slightly paler shade of brown than his right. He looked at Izuku, and his expression wasn't one of heroic pride, but of profound annoyance. "You," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "What in the name of the Soul King were you thinking?" Izuku's jaw worked, but no sound came out. He was staring. A real Soul Reaper. Right here. He was talking to him. His brain, still reeling from the near-death experience, latched onto the one thing it knew how to do: analyze. Name unknown. Rank unknown, but the lack of a Haori suggests not a captain. Appearance: veteran, late 30s or early 40s in physical age. Zanpakuto, standard katana type. Fighting style: efficient, single-strike execution. Implies high proficiency in Zanjutsu. Ryatsu control: excellent, minimal energy wasted. Are you listening to me, boy? The Soul Reaper snapped, taking a step closer. You're lucky I was in the area. That thing would have torn your soul to shreds. What's wrong with you? Humans who can see us are supposed to have enough sense to run. I couldn't, Izuku finally managed to stammer, his voice cracking. My friend, he was. I had to do something. The man's tired eyes softened, just a fraction. He looked from Izuku's terrified face to the spot where the hollow had vanished. You threw your backpack at it. It wasn't a question, it was a flat, incredulous statement. Izuku's face flushed. It was all I had. The Soul Reaper shook his head, a ghost of a wry smile touching his lips before vanishing. Courage and stupidity often look the same from a distance. You have an unusually high level of spiritual awareness to be able to see me this clearly. You're a beacon, kid. Walking around like this, you're practically ringing the dinner bell for every hollow in a 2-mile radius. He knelt, his movements stiff. Izuku noticed for the first time a dark stain spreading across the man's left side, just below his ribs. It wasn't from this fight. This was an older wound, one that had clearly been bothering him. When you feel that cold, when the air gets heavy, the man said, his voice taking on a lecturing tone, you run. You don't shout. You don't throw things. You hide. The Suriadii doesn't have the resources to assign a bodyguard to every spiritually sensitive human in this town. We have our hands full as it is. The Suriadii, that's your headquarters, isn't it? Izuku breathed, his fear momentarily forgotten, replaced by an insatiable curiosity. In the place you call the Soul Society? You use Zanpakuto to cleanse hollows and perform Kanso on pluses to help them pass on. Your powers are based on your Riryoku, your spiritual power, and you channel it into Zanjutsu, Hakuda, Hoho, and Kido. The man stared at him, his eyebrows raised in genuine surprise. How do you know all that? I watch, Izuku admitted, his cheeks burning again. I see you. All of you. I take notes. Before the Soul Reaper could respond, he suddenly winced, his hand pressing against the wound on his side. He gritted his teeth, a sheen of sweat breaking out on his forehead. Damn it, old injury, decided now was a great time to act up. It was then that Izuku realized his mistake. His distraction. His yell. It hadn't just drawn the Hollow's attention. It had drawn the Soul Reaper's too. In that split second of turning his focus, of assessing the situation with the new variable, a reckless human child, he must have been a fraction of a second slower than usual. The Hollow, in its death throes, must have landed a glancing blow, or the strain of the quick movement aggravated the old wound. It was his fault. He had distracted a hero, and gotten him hurt. The thought was a spike of ice in his gut. I'm sorry, Izuku whispered, shame washing over him. This is my fault. It's nothing, the man grunted, straightening up slowly. Just try not to make a habit of it. Now go home. And stay out of trouble. He began to turn, preparing to leave. But as he did, the world went silent. The distant sound of traffic faded. The drip of the pipe in the underpass stopped. The air, which had been returning to normal, suddenly became thick, heavy, and crushingly cold. It was a pressure so immense it felt like the bottom of the ocean. Izuku's knees buckled, and he gasped for air that wouldn't come. This wasn't the fleeting chill of a standard hollow. This was something else entirely. This was primordial dread given weight and substance. The Soul Reaper froze, his weary face instantly hardening into a mask of grim disbelief. He slowly looked up, past the concrete lip of the underpass, toward the sky. No, he breathed, his voice tight with alarm. It can't be. Izuku, forcing his head up, followed his gaze. The sky above his neighborhood was darkening, but not with clouds. A tear was ripping through the fabric of reality. It was a jagged, black fissure, outlined in crackling crimson energy. It looked like the world was being torn open, and from that tear something emerged. It was huge. Easily 3 stories tall. It was built like a monstrous gorilla, with a body of pitch-black fur and long, disproportionately powerful arms that ended in massive, clawed hands. Its mask was that of a snarling ape, with great, bony tusks jutting from its jaw. A cavernous hole gaped in the center of its chest, and its eyes were twin pits of malevolent, yellow light, burning with a hunger that seemed to eclipse the sun. It let out a roar. It wasn't a sound one heard with their ears. It was a physical force, a wave of pure spiritual pressure that slammed into the city. Windows rattled for blocks. Car alarms shrieked. Every plus in the vicinity either scattered in terror or dissolved on the spot, their forms too fragile to withstand such a presence. Izuku felt the roar in his bones, a vibration that threatened to shake his very soul apart. He knew, with a certainty that defied logic, what this was. He'd seen crude sketches of them in one of his notebooks, based on a fleeting glimpse from a battle so far away he could barely make it out. This was a higher order of monster. This was a nightmare that dwarfed the thing he had just faced. The veteran Soul Reaper was pale. A tyrant class, here? Now? He cursed under his breath, a stream of harsh, unfamiliar words. The patrol report said this sector was quiet. The giant ape hollow landed on the street with a ground-shaking thud that cracked the asphalt. It sniffed the air, its head turning, its yellow eyes scanning. Then, it locked onto something. Its gaze moved past the underpass, past the next block, and settled. It settled on the apartment building with the green roof. The apartment building where Inko Midoriya was likely starting to prepare dinner. Izuku's apartment. His home. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. A strangled noise escaped his throat. My mom. The hollow took a step, its massive foot crushing a parked car as if it were a tin can. It began to move, its destination horrifically clear. It was heading straight for his home. It had been drawn by the spiritual energy of the first fight, a scavenger drawn to a fresh kill, and now it had locked onto the source of the lingering scent, the place where Izuku lived. No! Izuku whispered, scrambling to his feet. He had to get there. He had to warn her. He had to do something. He didn't know what, but he had to move. A hand clamped down on his shoulder, strong and unyielding. Stay put, you idiot! The Soul Reaper barked. His face was grim, his eyes darting between the colossal hollow and Izuku. But my mom is in there! Izuku cried, his voice cracking with panic. I have to. You'll do nothing but get yourself killed, the man retorted. He drew his Zanpakuto again, the clean shing of steel barely audible over the monster's heavy footfalls. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but Izuku could see the tremor in his hand, the way his knuckles were white where he gripped the hilt. The man was injured, exhausted, and now he was facing a beast far beyond the scope of a simple patrol. The hollow roared again and began to lumber forward, faster now, shaking the very foundations of the neighborhood. The Soul Reaper took a shaky step forward, planting his feet in a swordsman's stance. He was the only thing standing between that monster and Izuku's home. He was a hero, but even from his position of terrified ignorance, Izuku could see the truth. The man was faltering. His spiritual pressure, which had felt like a steady flame before, was now flickering like a candle in a gale. He was running on fumes. He couldn't win. He might not even survive. And it was all because of Izuku. He had lured this thing here with his bright, untrained soul, and he had gotten the only person who could stop it injured with his reckless attempt at heroism. Guilt, stark and suffocating, choked him. Despair followed close behind. He was going to watch this brave, tired man die, and then he was going to watch that thing destroy his home, and his mother. He couldn't bear it. The Soul Reaper glanced back at him, his expression a mixture of grim determination and something else. Resignation. He saw the sheer, unadulterated terror in Izuku's eyes, but beneath the terror, he saw something else, too. The boy wasn't trying to run away. He was standing his ground, his small, powerless body planted between the monster and the path to his home, as if he could somehow shield it with his own life. It was the most foolish, and the most heroic, thing the man had ever seen. He saw the unyielding spirit of a hero trapped in the fragile body of a boy. The hollow was closing in, raising one of its enormous, clawed fists to smash the first building in its path. There was no time. No time for reinforcements. No time for a plan. There was only the monster, the boy, and a choice. A terrible, forbidden choice. The Soul Reaper turned his full attention to Izuku, his tired eyes suddenly burning with an intense, desperate light. Boy, he said, his voice low and urgent, overriding the sound of impending destruction. I'm going to ask you a question. Answer me now. Do you want the power to protect them? Izuku stared at him, his mind reeling. The question hung in the air, a lifeline thrown into an ocean of despair. It was the echo of a dream he thought had died years ago, in a doctor's office. Power, the one thing he lacked. The one thing he craved, not for glory, but for this. For this exact moment. To stand in the way of the things that go bump in the night and say, no further. Tears streamed down his face, born of fear and a sudden, impossible surge of hope. His voice was a choked, desperate whisper, but it was unwavering. Yes. A grim, determined smile touched the Soul Reaper's lips. I figured you'd say that. He moved, his speed belying his injury. He closed the distance between them in a single step, his unsheathed Zanpakuto held in a reverse grip. This is a grave sin, the man said, his voice barely audible. A crime of the highest order in the Soul Society. But right now, I don't give a damn. And with a final, desperate prayer to a king he wasn't sure was listening, Captain Kenshin Tatsuya of Squad 5 plunged the length of his soul-cutting sword directly into Izuku Midoriya's chest. The world did not end in a flash of pain. It ended in a tide of cold fire. The tip of the Zanpakuto pierced Izuku Midoriya's sternum, sliding between his ribs with an impossible, frictionless grace. There was no tearing of flesh, no gush of blood. The steel was not a physical object invading his body, but a spiritual key unlocking his soul. The sensation was immediate and absolute. It was a plunge into an Arctic Ocean that was simultaneously ablaze, a torrent of energy that was not his own flooding every cell, every nerve, every fiber of his being. His own small, flickering spiritual essence, the faint pilot light of his awareness, was suddenly engulfed by a supernova. He felt a presence, ancient and powerful, pour into him. It was Kenshin Tatsuya's soul, a lifetime of experience, sorrow, and battle-honed will, being decanted from one vessel to another. He felt the sting of 1,000 cuts, the exhaustion of battles fought under a moon that never set, the grim satisfaction of a hollow's mask cracking under his blade, the hollow ache of comrades lost centuries ago. Memories that were not his slammed into his consciousness like a tidal wave. Through the overwhelming flood, Izuku could see Kenshin's face, etched with a desperate, terrible resolve. The man's jaw was clenched, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was performing an act so fundamentally against the laws of his world that it was akin to blasphemy. The Gotei 13, the military of the Soul Society, was built on order, on balance. The transfer of a Soul Reaper's power to a human was the ultimate act of chaos, an unforgivable disruption of that balance. It was a crime punishable by death, or worse. Kenshin knew this. He could feel his own power, the Riryoku he had cultivated for over 300 years, draining from him like water from a shattered cup. It was an agonizing, hollowing sensation, a profound amputation of the very core of his being. But as he looked at the boy, at this strange, terrified, yet unblinking child who had thrown a backpack at a monster to save a friend, he knew he had no other choice. Duty to the Suriidii was one thing, the duty to protect the souls standing right in front of him was another. And in this moment, the latter was the only one that mattered. The colossal ape hollow, the tyrant-class beast, paused in its destructive advance. The sudden, violent eruption of spiritual pressure from the underpass was like a new, brighter sun appearing in the sky. It was confusing. The powerful, familiar scent of the Soul Reaper was being subsumed by something new, something raw and unstable and overwhelmingly potent. The beast tilted its massive, masked head, its burning yellow eyes narrowing at the source of the blinding light. A column of incandescent green energy erupted from Izuku's chest, punching a hole through the roof of the underpass and soaring into the darkening sky. The concrete and rebar vaporized, not from heat, but from the sheer force of the spiritual pressure. Kenshin was thrown backward, the hilt of his Zanpakuto ripped from his grasp. He landed hard against the far wall, his body suddenly feeling heavy, sluggish, and painfully mortal. The black shahakusho he wore seemed to fade, the fabric turning a dull, lifeless gray, no longer a conduit for his power but just cloth. His connection to his Zanpakuto, a bond forged over centuries, was severed. The resulting emptiness was a physical agony, a phantom limb syndrome of the soul. Izuku was floating in the center of the vortex. The world around him had dissolved into a maelstrom of emerald light and screaming wind. The memories and experiences of Kenshin Tatsuya churned within him, not as coherent thoughts but as raw emotion, duty, loss, anger, peace. He felt the weight of the sword in his hand, though his fingers were not yet closed around it. He felt the whisper of a name that was not his to know, the name of Kenshin's Zanpakuto, a name he would now never be able to speak again. His worn, slightly too large middle school uniform, the dark Gakurin jacket and trousers, began to smolder. They weren't burning, but unraveling, the physical threads dissolving as the spiritual power rewove his existence. In their place, new garments formed out of the raw energy. Black kosode and hakama, the traditional uniform of a soul reaper, materialized around him. A white obese sash cinched itself at his waist. The clothes felt impossibly light yet imbued with a sense of profound weight and purpose. In his right hand, the light coalesced. It solidified, taking the shape of a sword. It was not Kenshin's ornate blade. It was a simple, nameless katana, an asachi. Its hilt was wrapped in plain black cloth, its guard a simple, unadorned rectangle of dark metal, its blade a deep, non-reflective obsidian. It was a blank slate. A vessel waiting to be filled, waiting for a name. Waiting for a soul to pour into it. The vortex of green light imploded, rushing back into Izuku's body. He dropped to the ground, landing in a low crouch on the cracked pavement. For a moment, there was an absolute, ringing silence. He lifted his head. His green eyes, usually wide with a sort of nervous awe, were now blazing with a ferocious, untamed light. His wild, dark green hair seemed to crackle with static energy. He was still Izuku Midoriya, but he was also something more. Something new and terrifyingly powerful. The power inside him was not the controlled, flowing river of Kenshin's Ryoryoku. It was a roaring inferno. A reactor core going critical. It had no finesse, no discipline. It was a primal force, the combined spiritual energy of a veteran soul reaper crammed into the soul of a boy who had never known any power at all. It was too much. It screamed in his veins, demanding release. He felt less like a wielder and more like a container that was about to burst. The Tyrant Hollow, having processed the change, let out a roar of rage and hunger. This new presence was an affront. It was an all-you-can-eat buffet that was threatening to burn the restaurant down. It charged, its massive fists raised, intent on crushing this anomaly before it could fully stabilize. Izuku watched it come. The analytical part of his brain, the part that filled notebooks, was still there, a tiny, terrified voice screaming observations from the back of his mind. Massive physical strength, high-density Hiero armor. Spiritual pressure is off the charts. Approach vector is direct. No sign of Zero usage yet. Unpredictable. But the rest of him wasn't listening. The rest of him was instinct. It was the inherited battle sense of Kenshin Tatsuya and the desperate, bone-deep yearning of Izuku Midoriya to protect. The two impulses fused into a single, overwhelming command, act. He didn't know how to use a sword. He had never held one in his life. But his body knew. The power flowing through him knew. His feet shifted, sliding into a perfect swordsman's stance that he had never learned. His grip on the asachi was firm, flawless. He raised the blade, not with the grace of a seasoned warrior, but with the raw, desperate strength of a cornered animal. The hollow was almost upon him, its shadow engulfing the entire street. It brought its right fist down, a fist the size of a small car, aimed at turning Izuku into a black smear on the pavement. Izuku did not block. He did not dodge. He swung. He poured every ounce of the raging inferno inside him into the nameless blade. There was no release command, no technique name shouted to the heavens. There was only a desperate, guttural cry that was torn from his lungs. It was a cry of fear, of rage, of a lifetime of helplessness finally, violently, cast aside. The air in front of the blade warped. The world seemed to lose its color, bleached to monochrome for a split second before an explosion of raw, untamed green energy erupted from the sword. It was not a clean, focused arc of power like a Getsuga Tensho. It was a cataclysm. A wave of pure, unrestrained destruction that was wider than the street, a roaring tsunami of spiritual force. The hollow's descending fist disintegrated before it made contact. The wave of green energy slammed into its chest, and its thick, bone-like armor, its hiero, offered no resistance. It cracked, shattered, and was blasted away into particles. The energy tore through the monster's torso, vaporizing everything in its path. For a single, silent moment, the Tyrant Hollow was frozen, a colossal statue with a gaping, glowing green hole where its body used to be. Then, With a final, silent scream that echoed only in the spiritual plane, the rest of its body dissolved into dust, its mass crumbling last. The wave of power did not stop. It continued its path of annihilation, carving a deep, smoking trench down the center of the road, bisecting lampposts, mailboxes, and a delivery truck before finally expending its energy and dissipating a quarter of a mile away, leaving a trail of utter devastation in its wake. Silence descended once more, thick and heavy. The only sound was the distant, belated wail of car alarms and the gentle tinkle of glass falling from a shattered window frame far down the street. From his position slumped against the wall, Kenshin Tatsuya could only stare, his one good eye wide with a mixture of profound shock and a dawning, terrible awe. He had expected the boy to be powerful. The transfer guaranteed that. He had expected him to be able to fight, perhaps even defeat the Tyrant Hollow. What he had not expected was that wasn't a sword strike. That was an act of God. It was the single most inefficient, uncontrolled, and devastatingly powerful blast of raw Riryoku he had ever witnessed. The boy hadn't used the technique. He had simply opened the floodgates and allowed the full, undiluted power of a veteran Soul Reaper to erupt in a single, calamitous instant. The waste of energy was appalling. The result was undeniable. In the center of the street, Izuku stood swaying, the Asachi still held in his hand. The green glow in his eyes faded, replaced by a look of dazed, horrified confusion. He stared at his own hands, then at the sword, then at the path of destruction he had carved through his own neighborhood. The houses on either side of the trench were scorched, their windows blown out. The street he had walked down every day of his life was now a smoldering canyon. I did this? He whispered, his voice trembling. The adrenaline that had sustained him, the raw power that had filled him, vanished as quickly as it had come. The inferno inside him sputtered out, leaving behind only cold, gray ash and an exhaustion so profound it felt like a physical weight trying to crush him into the ground. His body, a frail, human machine that had just been used as a conduit for a nuclear reaction, began to shut down. Every muscle screamed in protest. Black spots danced in his vision. The Soul Reaper uniform, the Shihakusho, flickered and dissolved back into emerald light, leaving him once again in the tattered, torn remains of his school uniform. The Asachi felt impossibly heavy. It slipped from his nerveless fingers, clattering onto the cracked asphalt with a sound that seemed deafeningly loud in the sudden quiet. His knees gave way. He pitched forward, his consciousness spiraling down into a welcome, bottomless darkness. He was out before he hit the ground. Kenshin pushed himself off the wall, his body groaning in protest. He felt weak. So incredibly weak. The air felt thin in his lungs. His limbs were heavy, uncooperative. He was no longer a Soul Reaper. He was just a soul, a spirit, inhabiting a Jugai, a temporary artificial body he'd procured from a certain shady dealer in Karakura town for just such emergencies. Without his Riryoku, he couldn't even exit it. He was trapped. Powerless. Human. He stumbled over to where Izuku lay, his worn boots crunching on loose gravel. The boy was sprawled on the ground, completely unconscious, looking small and fragile amidst the wreckage he had created. Kenshin knelt, his joints creaking, and checked the boy's pulse. It was faint but steady. He was alive, just completely and utterly drained. Kenshin looked from the sleeping boy to the trench that scarred the street. He looked at the dissolving particles of the Tyrant Hollow that still hung in the air like malevolent snowflakes. He had broken one of the Soul Society's most sacred laws. He had forsaken his duty, his rank, and his power. He had gambled everything, his past, his present, his future, on the heroic spirit of a quirkless, powerless child. And that child had responded by unleashing enough raw power to level a city block. A low, humorless chuckle escaped Kenshin's lips. Kisuke Urahara is going to have a field day with this, he muttered to himself, the name of his Jugai provider a sour taste in his mouth. He knew what came next. The massive, uncontrolled flare of spiritual pressure would have registered as a seismic event in the Siriidi's monitoring stations. They would have seen a captain-level Ryatsu signature vanish, only to be replaced by a new, unknown signature of catastrophic intensity. They would send someone to investigate. Not just anyone either. They would send executioners. captains of the Godai 13, or members of the Amatsukido, the stealth force. They would come to pass judgment on him for his crime, and on the boy for being the result of it. He had bought the town a few hours of safety, but he may have just signed both of their death warrants. He looked down at Izuku's face. Even in unconsciousness, it was earnest, etched with a sort of worried sincerity. The face of a boy who cried watching heroes on the news. The face of a boy who threw himself in front of danger without a second thought. The face of a boy who, when offered power, didn't ask the price, only if it could be used to protect. A grim resolve settled over Kenshin. He had made his choice. He had placed his bet. Now, he had to see it through. He had to train this boy. He had to teach him to control the cataclysm he now held inside him. He had to prepare him for the storm that was coming for them both. You wanted to be a hero, kid, Kenshin murmured, his voice rough with exhaustion. He reached out and brushed a stray lock of green hair from the boy's forehead. Congratulations. You saved the day. He looked again at the path of destruction, the smoldering ruins of a once peaceful suburban street. Now comes the hard part. He gently lifted Izuku into his arms. The boy was lighter than he expected. Kenshin's new, powerless body strained with the effort. He began the slow, arduous walk toward the boy's miraculously untouched apartment building, away from the evidence of their impossible battle. In the distance, the sirens of the living world began to sing, a lament for a fight they would never see, a warning of a chaos they could never comprehend. The war for Izuku Midoriya's soul had just begun. Izuku's first sensation upon returning to consciousness was the smell of ointment. It was a sharp, medicinal scent, a complex blend of antiseptic, ginger, and something vaguely floral, like chamomile. It was the smell of his mother's first aid kit, a scent he associated with scraped knees, childhood fevers, and the gentle, fussing care that had been the one constant in his life. His second sensation was pain. Not the sharp, acute pain of an injury, but a deep, resonant ache that seemed to emanate from his very bones. Every muscle felt as if it had been stretched to its breaking point, and then snapped back into place. He felt hollowed out, as if something immense had been scooped from his core, leaving behind a fragile, trembling shell. He groaned, his eyelids fluttering open. The world swam into focus slowly. He wasn't in the ruined street. He was in his bedroom, lying in his own bed. The familiar posters of the #1 pro hero, All Might, smiled down at him from the walls, their bright, primary colors a stark contrast to the grim monochrome of his recent memories. Sunlight, soft and golden, streamed through his window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. For a surreal moment, he wondered if it had all been a nightmare. Then he tried to sit up. A wave of vertigo and nausea crashed over him, and the deep ache in his body intensified into a chorus of screaming agony. He collapsed back onto his pillows, a strangled gasp escaping his lips. It hadn't been a dream. The phantom weight of the sword in his hand, the memory of the green inferno erupting from his body. It was all terrifyingly real. The door to his room creaked open. Izuku? You're awake! His mother, Inko Midoriya, rushed to his bedside. Her face, usually so soft and cheerful, was etched with deep lines of worry. Her eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, and she wrung her hands with an anxiety that was almost palpable. Oh, my baby! I was so worried, she fretted, her hand gently touching his forehead. The doctors couldn't find anything wrong, but you were out for 2 whole days. They said it was just exhaustion, after the accident. Accident? Izuku croaked, his throat dry and scratchy. The gas main explosion down the street, she explained, her voice trembling slightly. It was terrible. It tore up the whole road. The noise. I thought the whole building was coming down. When you didn't come home, I was frantic. Then, that man, Mr. Tatsuya, he brought you home. He said he found you near the blast, that the shockwave must have knocked you out. Tatsuya. The name echoed in his mind. The Soul Reaper. Kenshin Tatsuya. He had given a name, a cover story. He had thought of everything. He's been so kind, Inko continued, oblivious to the storm in her son's mind. He's been staying here, watching over you. He said he was an old friend of your father's, from his time overseas, a kendo instructor. He even made this salve for your muscles. said it was an old family recipe. She gestured to the small ceramic pot on his nightstand, the source of the medicinal smell. Izuku stared at the pot. A kendo instructor. An old family friend. The lies were so simple, so plausible. Kenshin was not just a warrior, he was a professional, practiced in the art of blending in, of maintaining the veil between their worlds. As if summoned, the man himself appeared in the doorway. Kenshin Tatsuya no longer wore the tattered remnants of his Soul Reaper uniform. He was dressed in simple, modern civilian clothes, dark jeans and a plain gray Henley shirt that seemed a bit too snug for his broad shoulders. He looked distressingly normal, if not for the jagged scar over his eye and the weary, ancient quality in his gaze. He could have been any other man. But Izuku could feel the change in him. The immense, steady fire of his spiritual pressure was gone, replaced by the faint, sputtering ember of a normal human soul. He was trapped in his Jigai, a giant in a cage of flesh. He's awake, then, Kenshin said, his voice the same gravelly baritone Izuku remembered. He offered Inko a small, reassuring smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. That's good to hear. The boy is resilient. I'll go make some tea, Inko said, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. You both must have so much to talk about. Catching up, after all this time. She bustled out of the room, leaving a tense, heavy silence in her wake. Kenshin walked into the room and closed the door softly behind him. He leaned against it, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he just looked at Izuku, his gaze analytical, searching. How do you feel? He finally asked. Like I was hit by a train, Izuku answered honestly, his voice barely a whisper. And then the train exploded. A faint, wry smile touched Kenshin's lips. Close enough. You outputted enough Riryoku to power the Kido core for a week in a single sword swing. Your soul is essentially a drained battery. Your body is just reflecting that exhaustion. It's a miracle it didn't tear you apart. The memory of the destruction, the smoking trench carved through his neighborhood, flashed in Izuku's mind. Guilt, sharp and cold, twisted in his gut. The street, our neighborhood, is being repaired, Kenshin cut in, his voice firm. The official story is a faulty subterranean gas line. The Special Cleanup Division from the Soul Society did a memory modification sweep on the immediate witnesses to erase any inconsistencies. As far as the living world is concerned, it was a tragic but mundane industrial accident. Izuku stared at his hands. Mundane. There was nothing mundane about what he had done. So, what happens now? Kenshin pushed himself off the door and walked over to the window, staring out at the city below. Now, he said, his back to Izuku, we face the consequences of my actions. And yours. He turned, his expression grim. Let's not mince words, kid. I didn't give you a quirk. I committed a felony on a cosmic scale. The transfer of Soul Reaper powers to a human is one of the gravest crimes a member of the Godai 13 can commit. It fundamentally unbalances the flow of souls between worlds. It's a capital offense. Izuku's blood ran cold. Capital, you mean? I mean they'll send someone to execute me, Kenshin stated bluntly, with no hint of melodrama. And you are the evidence of the crime. The anomaly that must be corrected. They won't see a hero who saved his town. They'll see a contaminated human soul, a dangerous loose cannon who needs to be neutralized. They'll try to strip you of the powers I gave you. If they can't, they'll eliminate you too. The room felt suddenly small, the walls closing in. This was so much bigger than just fighting monsters. He had been dragged into a political, judicial nightmare he couldn't begin to comprehend. This is my fault, Izuku whispered, the words tasting like ash. I distracted you. I got you hurt. I forced you to. You forced me to do nothing, Kenshin interrupted, his voice sharp as steel. I saw a tyrant hollow about to obliterate a city block. I saw my own power failing, and I saw a powerless boy with the eyes of a protector who refused to run. I made a choice. It was my choice, and I'll live or die by it. The question is, what will you do? Izuku looked at him, bewildered. What can I do? You can learn, Kenshin said, his gaze intense. You can learn to control the goddamn nuclear reactor I shoved into your soul. That blast of yours was impressive, I'll grant you that. But it was also sloppy, wasteful, and you were lucky you didn't wipe your own apartment building off the map. You have the power of a veteran Soul Reaper, but the control of an infant. Right now, you're more dangerous to this city than any hollow. He walked over to Izuku's desk and picked up the Asachi, which was leaning against the wall. He had somehow retrieved it. He held it out to Izuku. This is yours now, Kenshin said. It is the vessel for the power you now hold. You have a new title, whether you want it or not. You are a substitute Soul Reaper. It's not a badge of honor. It's a burden. It means the responsibility for this town's spiritual well-being now falls to you. Izuku stared at the black, nameless sword. 1,000 questions, 1,000,000 fears swirled in his mind. But through the terror and the guilt, a single, defiant thought broke through. He remembered the feeling of standing between the monster and his home. He remembered the desperate desire to protect. And he remembered the moment the power had flooded him, a feeling of finally being able to stand and fight. His hand, though it trembled, was steady as he reached out and took the sword. The moment his fingers closed around the hilt, a faint, familiar warmth spread up his arm. It felt heavy, alien, but right. Okay, Izuku said, his voice quiet but firm. Okay. Teach me. 3 days later, Izuku stood in the cavernous, echoing space of an abandoned warehouse down by the city's industrial port. The air was thick with the smell of rust, salt, and decay. Shattered skylights high above cast down geometric patterns of pale moonlight onto the dusty concrete floor. Kenshin stood opposite him, a wooden bakken in his hand. All right. Let's start with the absolute basics. Zanjutsu. The art of the sword. The foundation of a Soul Reaper's combat style. He demonstrated a simple, two-handed stance, his form perfect despite his lack of power. Your center of gravity is key. Feet shoulder-width apart, knees slightly bent. The sword is an extension of your body, not a separate tool. Power comes from your hips, your core. Got it? All right, Izuku stammered, trying to mimic the stance. He felt clumsy, awkward. The Asachi felt less like an extension of his body and more like a heavy, uncooperative iron bar. Now, a simple downward slash, Kenshin instructed. Don't try to obliterate the building. Just a clean, controlled cut. Feel the flow of your Riryoku into the blade. Just a trickle. Izuku took a deep breath. Just a trickle. He focused, trying to will a small amount of the energy simmering within him down his arms and into the sword. He raised the Asachi over his head. For a moment, he felt it, a gentle warmth in the blade. Then he swung. The result was instantaneous and disastrous. The trickle became a deluge. The air shrieked as a wave of brilliant green energy, smaller than the one that had destroyed the street but still terrifyingly potent, erupted from the sword. It slammed into the far wall of the warehouse, blasting a hole the size of a doorway through the corrugated steel and sending a shower of rust and debris raining down. Izuku stared in horror, his arms trembling from the recoil. I tried to hold back, Kenshin sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Your idea of holding back is the difference between a tactical nuke and a city buster. You have zero finesse. Your control is a rusty spigot that's either completely shut or blasting at full pressure. Let's try again. This time, use no Riryoku at all. Just a physical swing. They tried again. And again. For over an hour, Izuku practiced the basic forms. His swings were clumsy, his footwork a mess. He was strong for his age, but he had none of the ingrained muscle memory of a swordsman. He was all thought and no instinct. This isn't working, Kenshin finally said, rubbing his temples. Your body doesn't know what it's doing. Let's switch gears. Maybe you'll have more of an aptitude for Kido. He led Izuku to a clearer part of the warehouse. Kido, or the demon arts, is the ability to shape your spiritual energy into spells. It's about will and imagination. You take the formless energy inside you, give it shape and purpose through an incantation, and release it. He described the simplest of binding spells. Bakudo No. 1, Sai. It creates a simple spiritual restraint that pins the target's arms behind their back. The incantation is unnecessary for a spell this week, but for you, it's a required focus. Now, extend your finger, Visualize the energy gathering, and say the name. Izuku nodded, his brow furrowed in concentration. This seemed more his speed. It wasn't about physical grace, it was about focus. He extended his index finger toward a stack of old, rusted barrels. He took a breath, trying to picture the energy Kenshin described. Bakudo number 1, sigh! He yelled. A fizzing, popping sound erupted from his fingertip. A shower of green sparks, like faulty fireworks, shot out and harmlessly splattered against the barrels. There was no binding, no restraint, just a pathetic little fizzle. He smelled ozone and burned hair. Less, Kenshin grunted. You're trying to force it. It's not about brute strength. Kido is an art. It's like painting. You don't just throw the whole bucket at the canvas. Feel the energy. Guide it. Izuku tried again. He closed his eyes, focusing with all his might. He tried to feel the energy, to gently coax it forward. He pictured it, a calm, flowing river. Sigh. This time, the result was worse. A ball of unstable green energy the size of a grapefruit formed at his fingertip, wobbled violently for a second, and then detonated with a sharp crack. The force threw him backward onto the dusty floor, his hand numb and tingling, his ears ringing. Kenshin stared at the smoking spot on the floor where Izuku had been standing, his expression one of utter disbelief. How is it possible, he said, his voice dangerously quiet, to be simultaneously a fire hose and a clogged drain? I've never seen anything like it. Izuku pushed himself up, his body aching, his spirit bruised. He was failing. Just like he had always failed at everything that required a power he didn't have. He had this incredible, world-shattering energy inside him, and he couldn't even manage the most basic spell. The familiar, bitter taste of uselessness filled his mouth. I can't do it, he mumbled, staring at his tingling hand. I don't feel it. You say feel the energy, but it's just a roar. It's just noise. I can't pick out a single note. Kenshin let out a long, weary sigh. He walked over and sat down on an old crate, his shoulders slumping. He looked, for the first time, not like a legendary warrior, but like a tired, depowered old man who was in way over his head. Maybe this was a mistake, Kenshin said, more to himself than to Izuku. I saw the heart of a hero, but I forgot that the body and soul need to be able to keep up. I've been teaching you like I'd teach a Soul Reaper recruit in the academy, assuming a lifetime of intuitive spiritual awareness. But you're not one of them. You're something else. He fell silent, and the weight of their situation settled over the warehouse. They were two fugitives, a powerless master and a prodigy of destruction with no control, waiting for the executioner's axe to fall. Izuku sat there amidst the dust and the moonlight, the familiar despair washing over him. He was going to get them both killed. He was just a useless Deku, after all. But then, a flicker of defiance sparked within him. He had been told he was useless his whole life. He had been told he couldn't be a hero. He had always found a way to push back, to keep moving forward. He wouldn't stop now. If he couldn't do it Kenshin's way, then he would have to find his own. He reached into the inner pocket of the black shahakusho he now wore. The uniform had materialized around him the moment he gripped his Asachi with intent, a fact that still bewildered him. He pulled out a small, spiral-bound notebook and a pen. It was a fresh one he had bought 2 days ago. Kenshin watched, his eyebrows raised, as Izuku flipped to the first page. In his neat, slightly shaky handwriting, Izuku wrote a title, Soul Reaper Analysis for the Future, Volume 1. He clicked his pen. The small, familiar sound seemed to steady him. He wasn't a warrior. He wasn't a sorcerer. He was an analyst. And this was a problem that needed to be analyzed. What are you doing? Kenshin asked, his voice flat. I'm trying to understand, Izuku muttered, already scribbling furiously. Your method isn't working for me. I can't learn by intuition. I have to break it down. It has to make sense. Problem: uncontrolled Riryoku discharge during active use, Zanjutsu Kido. Subject: Izuku Midoriya, substitute Soul Reaper. Power source: transferred energy from veteran Soul Reaper, Captain K. Tatsuya. Observation: subject's spiritual control appears to be binary, 0% inactive, or 100% catastrophic overload. There is no intermediate state. Traditional training methods based on feel and intuition are ineffective. Kenshin got up and walked over, peering over Izuku's shoulder at the notebook. He read the frantic scribbles, his expression shifting from tired annoyance to bewilderment. Hypothesis: Riryoku behaves like a fluid or an electrical current. Veteran Soul Reapers possess an innate, subconscious circulatory system to regulate this flow. Subject lacks this system. Attempting to use Riryoku is like opening a dam wall instead of turning a faucet. Proposed solution: Kido, instead of attempting to feel the energy, create a structured, visualized pathway. A mental blueprint. Treat the incantation not as a key, but as the activation command for a pre-designed circuit. Visualize pipes, valves, and regulators to control the flow rate and pressure before the point of release. Proposed solution: Zanjutsu, the explosive discharge happens at the point of impact or the end of the swing. The energy is not being integrated into the kinetic motion. Treat the body and the sword as a single, unified delivery system. The goal is to achieve a constant, stable energy output throughout the entire physical motion, not just at the end. Perhaps visualize coating the blade in a thin, stable layer of energy before the swing even begins. Kenshin read the notes, and then read them again. He looked at Izuku, who was muttering to himself, tapping his pen against his chin, lost in his own world of theory and analysis. Pipes, valves, kinetic chains. Kenshin breathed, a look of profound astonishment on his face. Kid, what in the worlds are you talking about? It's the only way it makes sense. Izuku said, looking up, his eyes alight with a frantic energy Kenshin hadn't seen before. It wasn't the blazing fire of his Ryatsu. It was the sharp, focused light of his intellect. You're all using an advanced biological process you've never had to think about, like breathing, but I was never born with spiritual lungs, so I have to build my own mechanical ones from scratch. I have to think about every single step. He scrambled to his feet, his exhaustion forgotten. Let me try again. The Kido spell. He walked back to the barrels, notebook in hand. He closed his eyes, but this time he wasn't trying to feel anything. He was building. In his mind's eye, he visualized a complex network of glowing green pipes leading from the roaring furnace in his core, up his torso, and down his arm. He pictured a series of valves, which he mentally throttled down, restricting the flow to a mere trickle. He imagined a final regulator at his fingertip, ensuring the pressure was stable. It took him a full minute of intense, sweat-beating concentration. Then, he opened his eyes, aimed his finger, and spoke the word with a newfound, technical precision. Sigh. A thin, shimmering cord of yellow-green energy shot from his finger. It wasn't powerful. It wasn't fast. But it was controlled. It whipped through the air and wrapped itself neatly around the stack of barrels, binding them together with a soft hum. The binding was weak. A strong human could probably break it, but it was perfect in form. It was a successful cast. Izuku stared at it, his mouth agape. Then a huge, trembling grin spread across his face. I did it. It worked. Kenshin was speechless. For 300 years he had lived and fought by the sword. He had trained, taught, and battled alongside the most powerful souls in existence. All of them operated on talent, instinct, and hard-won experience. He had never, not once, seen anyone try to turn the art of the soul into a goddamn engineering problem. And he had certainly never seen it work. A slow smile spread across Kenshin's own face. It was the first genuine smile Izuku had ever seen from him. The weary, cynical mask fell away, replaced by a look of grudging, impressed respect. Well, I'll be damned, Kenshin said, shaking his head in disbelief. You really are something else, kid. He became serious again, his expression turning thoughtful. This changes things. Your method is slow, methodical, and probably useless in the heat of a fast-paced battle right now. But it's a foundation, a way for you to build the control you were never born with. He gestured to the Asachi lying on the floor. But all of this, your analysis, your circuits, your control, it's just a temporary fix. You're still just using the power I gave you. It's my energy, my Riryoku, that you're trying to tame. It will never truly be yours. It's like you're driving a car built for someone else. You can learn how it works, but it will never perfectly fit you. He walked over and picked up the nameless sword, holding it out to Izuku flat on his palms. That sword is more than just a lump of steel, Kenshin said, his voice dropping low, taking on a tone of reverence. Every Soul Reaper's Zanpakuto is a living entity. It is a reflection of their own soul. It has a consciousness. It has a name. Right now, what you hold is an Asachi, a blank slate, a nameless blade that all new recruits use. But the power I gave you resides within it, waiting for a new master. He looked Izuku directly in the eyes. To gain true control, to make that power your own, you need to connect with the soul inside that blade. You need to learn its name. Izuku took the sword, his gaze fixed on the simple, unadorned steel. A living soul. A name. When a Soul Reaper learns their Zanpakuto's name, Kenshin continued, they can release its true power. This first release is called Shirkai. It changes the form and grants the abilities unique to that sword, unique to that soul. My power is just the fuel in the tank, kid. Learning the name of your Zanpakuto, that is the key that starts the engine. Without it, you're just a glorified battery. With it, you will become a true Soul Reaper. Izuku looked down at the black katana in his hands. It was no longer just a weapon, a tool he had to learn to operate. It was a puzzle. A partner. A mystery sleeping in his hands, waiting for him to solve it. He thought of the roaring furnace inside him, the borrowed power he struggled to contain. And he thought of this blade, the key to forging that inferno into something that was truly, uniquely his. The path ahead was terrifying. The Soul Society was coming. But for the first time since waking up in his bed, Izuku felt a flicker not of fear, but of profound, determined excitement. The physical training had been a disaster. The real training was just about to begin. The abandoned warehouse had become their sanctuary, and their crucible. By day, Izuku was a normal middle school student, his mind a whirlwind of excuses for his constant fatigue and the strange, new weight he felt in his soul. He told his mother that kendo lessons, with Mr. Tatsuya, were incredibly demanding, an explanation she accepted with worried pride. But when dusk settled over Mizutsufu, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and dusky orange, his real training would begin. Tonight was different. There were no drills, no clumsy attempts at Kido that ended in sparks and frustration. The cavernous space was still, the only sound the gentle sigh of wind through the broken skylights. In the center of the concrete floor, Izuku sat cross-legged, the nameless Asachi laid carefully across his lap. Moonlight cast a silvery sheen on the blade's dark, unreflective surface. Jinzen is not about forcing a conversation, Kenshin Tatsuya said, his voice a low murmur from the shadows where he stood observing. You cannot knock on the door of your own soul and demand entry. It does not work that way. It is an act of surrender. You must quiet the world outside, and then, you must quiet the world inside. Izuku closed his eyes, his hands resting lightly on the cold steel of the sheathed sword. Quiet the world inside. For him, that was like asking a hurricane to stop blowing. His mind was a perpetual storm of analysis, anxiety, and self-doubt. As he sat there, 1,000 thoughts clamored for his attention. Did Mom believe my excuse for being so tired? What if the Soul Society is already here, watching us? My control is still terrible. That last Kido attempt nearly singed off my eyebrows. What would Kaken say if he saw me now? He'd call me a freak, and he'd probably be right. Am I really cut out for this? Kenshin-san sacrificed everything for me. What if I fail him? What if I fail everyone? He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to breathe. In, out. In, out. The rhythm was a fragile anchor in the tempest of his thoughts. He tried to focus on Kenshin's instruction. Your Zanpakuto is a part of you. The older man's voice drifted through the space. It was born from your soul, even if my power now fuels it. It has always been there, waiting. You are not reaching out to a stranger. You are trying to listen to a part of yourself that has been silent for a very long time. Stop trying to listen. Just be, just be. The instruction was so simple, so infuriatingly abstract. How could he just be when the fate of his world, and Kenshin's, rested on his narrow shoulders? He tried a different tactic, one born of his analytical nature. He began to catalog his physical sensations, a trick to ground himself, the cold of the concrete floor seeping through my hakama. The rough texture of the cloth wrap on the sword's hilt beneath my palms. The slight draft on the back of my neck from the broken wall. The weight of the blade itself, a solid, reassuring presence on my lap. He focused on that weight. It was the only thing that felt truly real in this new, terrifying life. It was a tangible piece of the impossible. He let his awareness sink into that sensation, following it down, as if it were a stone dropping into a deep, dark well. The clamor of his thoughts began to fade, the anxious voices growing distant, their words blurring into a meaningless hum. The sounds of the warehouse, the wind, Kenshin's quiet breathing, all receded. The feeling of the cold floor vanished. He was no longer sitting. He was falling. It was a gentle, weightless descent through an infinite, silent darkness. There was no wind, no sense of motion, only the serene feeling of release. The last vestiges of his physical self dissolved, and he was left as a single point of consciousness adrift in a void. This, he realized with a strange, detached calm, was his inner world. This was his soul. His descent slowed, and his non-existent feet touched down on a surface that was as black and absolute as the space around him. It felt like polished obsidian, yet it reflected nothing, not him, not the void, nothing. He looked down at himself. He appeared as he was, a boy in the black shahakusho of a soul reaper, but his form seemed to be woven from faint, glowing green threads of light, the only illumination in this starless universe. He was not alone. All around him, standing in perfect, unnerving silence, were figures. Hundreds of them. They were humanoid in shape, but their forms were made of shifting, semi-transparent shadow, their features indistinct and ever-changing. Some were tall and broad, others small and lithe. He could make out the faint outlines of different eras in their attire, the bulky armor of an ancient samurai, the simple robes of a monk, the flowing kimono of a noblewoman, the more practical shahakusho of soul reapers from different ages. They were a silent congregation of ghosts, a crowd of witnesses stretching back through time. These, he knew instinctively, were the vestiges. The echoes of the souls whose power had been passed down, generation to generation, culminating in Kenshin, and now, in him. They were the spiritual lineage of the power he now struggled to contain. None of them moved. None of them spoke. They simply stood and watched, their collective gaze a palpable weight on his consciousness. The pressure was immense, a silent, suffocating judgment. Izuku swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. Hello? He called out, his voice sounding small and thin in the vast emptiness. There was no answer, only the profound, crushing silence of the assembled shadows. He took a hesitant step forward, then another. He felt like an actor who had stumbled onto a stage in the middle of a play he didn't know, with an audience of gods. As he walked toward the center of the silent crowd, a new figure began to coalesce from the darkness before him. It did not emerge from the ranks of the shadowy vestiges. It formed from the very fabric of the void itself, a being of immense presence and solidity. It was a warrior, easily 7 feet tall, clad head to toe in interlocking plates of dark, gunmetal gray armor that seemed to drink the non-existent light. The armor was functional, unadorned, its design speaking of centuries of relentless duty. Its helmet was a smooth, featureless thing, a solid plate of steel where a face should be, with no visor, no eye slits, nothing. It was an effigy of implacable defense. It held no visible weapon, yet Izuku felt as though he were standing before an entire armory. Its spiritual pressure was not wild or aggressive. It was the calm, immense pressure of a mountain, a force of nature that had stood for eons and would stand for eons more. This was it. The core of the sword. The soul of his Zanpakuto. When it spoke, the voice was not a sound that traveled to his ears. It was a vibration that resonated directly in his soul, a deep, rumbling baritone that was neither male nor female, but something ancient and elemental. It was the sound of shifting bedrock and grinding glaciers. Who are you to claim this power? The question slammed into Izuku with physical force, making him stagger back a step. The silent vestiges seemed to lean forward in unison, their attention sharpening. I am Izuku Midoriya, he stammered, feeling utterly inadequate. It was given to me, given. The armored figure rumbled, the word a judgment in itself. Power is not a gift. It is a burden. A responsibility. It is earned through strength, through will, through sacrifice. You possess none of these. You are merely a vessel. A scared, weak, empty child. Each word was a hammer blow to his spirit. The figure raised a gauntlet hand, and the world around Izuku warped. The obsidian floor dissolved, and he was suddenly standing on a familiar street, under a bright blue sky. He was back in his middle school uniform, his body small, powerless, and in front of him, his childhood friend, Katsuki Bakugo, was being suffocated, his struggling form engulfed by a monster made of green sludge. Heroes stood by, unable to help. He remembered this day. It was one of the most shameful memories of his life, the day his own powerlessness had been laid so bare. He had stood there, frozen, while Kakin choked. You watched. The spirit's voice echoed around him, dripping with contempt. You stood by while another suffered, paralyzed by your own fear and inadequacy. You possessed the desire of a hero, but the spine of a coward. You did nothing of value. No, I. Izuku started to protest, remembering how he had, in the end, rushed forward. But the scene fast-forwarded. He saw himself being held back, scolded by the pro-heroes while all might save the day. The spirit was right. His reckless charge had only gotten in the way. He had done nothing of value. The vision shattered, and the darkness returned, but only for a moment. It was replaced by a new scene, a terrifying panorama of a city at war. Hollows, thousands of them, swarmed through the streets. Not just the simple ones, but Jillians, Ajuchas, monstrous beasts of every shape and size. He saw them tearing pluses apart, devouring human souls, their cacophonous shrieks a symphony of damnation. He saw soul reapers fighting and dying, overwhelmed by the sheer, endless tide of despair. This is the truth of the world you wish to protect. The spirit intoned, its voice devoid of emotion. A never-ending ocean of sorrow. A plague of hunger that can never be satisfied. You are one boy, a single drop of rain in a tsunami. You saved your town from one monster. Can you save all of these? Can you even save a fraction? Can you hear their cries? He could. He could hear the screams of countless souls, a chorus of agony that threatened to tear his sanity apart. He fell to his knees, clutching his head, the sheer scale of the suffering a physical weight crushing him. He was just one person. What could he possibly do against all of this? It was hopeless, utterly, completely hopeless. And oh! The spirit confirmed his despairing thought. You cannot! The vision of the city vanished, and he was back on the ruined street from 2 weeks ago. The smoking trench he had carved was there, but this time, the destruction was worse. The apartment building at the end of the road, his home, was a collapsed, smoldering wreck. A crater gaped where his living room should have been. A new, more terrible sound reached him. The sound of his mother Inko, weeping. He saw her spectral form, a translucent plus, kneeling in the wreckage, her body chained to the spot of her death, her face a mask of confusion and grief. No! Izuku choked out, tears finally breaking free and streaming down his face. No, this didn't happen. It did not. The armored spirit agreed, its form appearing beside him in the vision of ruin. But it could have. Your uncontrolled power nearly brought this upon your own home. You seek to protect, yet your very presence, your very power, brings only destruction. You are a beacon for the monsters, and a wrecking ball to the innocent. The spirit leaned down, its featureless helmet seeming to stare directly into the core of Izuku's soul. Its final question was the most devastating of all. What good is a pillar that crumbles and crushes those it means to support? You are unworthy. You are a failure. You are nothing. The words echoed, resonated, and affirmed every single doubt Izuku had ever had about himself. He was Deku. Useless. A fraud playing at being a hero, a danger to everyone around him. He collapsed completely, curling into a ball on the broken asphalt of his own failure, his body racked with sobs of pure, undiluted despair. The armored spirit stood over him, a silent, immovable monument to his inadequacy. The shadowy vestiges watched from the periphery, their judgment absolute. He had failed the test. He lay there for an eternity, drowning in his own sorrow. The spirit was right. It was all true. He couldn't save everyone. His power was a danger. He was weak and scared. It was all true. But a memory surfaced through the fog of his despair. The image of Tsubasa, his classmate, backed into the alley. The cold fear in the air. The feeling of his own legs, moving before he'd even thought to command them. The ridiculous, desperate act of throwing his backpack. He hadn't thought about saving the world then. He hadn't thought about whether he was worthy or strong enough. He had only seen one person, in trouble, right in front of him. And he had acted. His sobs began to subside, replaced by a ragged, hitching breath. He slowly, shakily, pushed himself up from the ground. His face was stained with tears, his body trembled, but the light in his glowing green form, which had dimmed to a faint flicker, began to brighten with a new, defiant resolve. He faced the towering armored figure, meeting its non-existent gaze without flinching. "You're right," he said, his voice hoarse but clear. "Everything you said is true." The spirit remained silent, waiting. "I can't save them all," Izuku continued, gesturing to the memory of the swarming hollows. "I know I can't. The world is too big, and there's too much sadness. To promise that I could save everyone would be a lie. It would be arrogant." He then looked at the vision of his ruined home, at the weeping ghost of his mother. The sight still sent a spike of agony through him, but his voice grew stronger. "And you're right that my power is dangerous. That I'm not strong enough, or skilled enough, to control it yet. I might fail. I might even make things worse sometimes. I'm not a perfect hero. I'm not All Might." He took a deep, shuddering breath and looked the spirit dead on. The fear was still there, but it was no longer in control. "But you're wrong about one thing," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction that came from the very core of his being. "You asked what good a pillar is if it cracks. But that's not the right question." He balled his trembling hands into fists. "I don't have to save everyone in the world. I just have to try and save the person right in front of me. I don't have to be perfect. I just have to be there. I can't stop the entire ocean of sorrow, but I can stand as a seawall for as long as I can. I can be a pillar. And it doesn't matter if the weight is too much. It doesn't matter if I crack. It doesn't even matter if I break and fall apart in the end." His voice rose, filled with a raw, passionate fire that pushed back the darkness. "If my standing here lets one person find safety behind me, if my cracking under the pressure buys one family another minute of peace, if I can be a shield for someone who needs it, even for a second, then it's worth it. My worth isn't measured by how many people I save. It's measured by my refusal to stop trying. I will be their pillar, even if it crushes me. That is my answer." He stood there, chest heaving, his declaration echoing in the profound silence that followed. He had offered no boasts, no grand promises. He had only offered his own pain, his own weakness, and his absolute, selfless willingness to bear the burden anyway. The visions of destruction and despair faded away, leaving them once again in the vast, dark space, surrounded by the silent vestiges. The armored spirit did not move for a long time. It simply stood, observing the small, trembling boy who had looked into the abyss of his own failure and found not despair, but purpose. Then, slowly, the colossal figure raised its gauntlet hand. Izuku flinched, expecting a final, dismissive blow. But the hand did not strike. It came to rest gently on his shoulder. The touch was not heavy or crushing. It was solid, firm, and deeply, profoundly reassuring. It felt like an anchor. "A pillar does not stand for its own glory." The spirit's voice rumbled, but the tone had changed. The cold judgment was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant approval. "It stands so that others do not fall. Your resolve is true." As it spoke, a ripple went through the crowd of shadowy vestiges. In perfect, synchronized unison, the hundreds of silent figures bowed their heads to him. It was a gesture of acceptance, of acknowledgement. He was no longer just a vessel. He was their successor. The armored figure's hand remained on his shoulder. "We are the sum of all who have stood before. We are the foundation on which the helpless stand. We are the support that bears the unbearable weight." The voice was joined by others, a chorus of whispers rising from the vestiges, hundreds of voices speaking as one, echoing the spirit's words. We are the pillar upon which heroes are built. You have answered the call. You have earned the right to speak our name. The name bloomed in Izuku's mind, not as a word, but as a concept, a feeling of unshakable support and heroic sacrifice. It was a name that fit him so perfectly it felt like a part of his own soul he had just discovered. Speak it! The chorus of voices commanded, their power flowing into him, a feeling not of a raging inferno, but of a deep, solid, unshakable mountain. Speak our name, and we will answer. We are Yawayu no Hashira. The name, Pillar of Heroes, slammed into his consciousness, and the world of his soul dissolved into a blinding flash of emerald light. He gasped, his eyes flying open. He was back in the warehouse, the cold of the concrete a sudden shock to his system. His body was drenched in sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs like a drum. He looked up. Kenshin was standing exactly where he had been, his expression patient, unreadable. You're back, the depowered Soul Reaper said, his voice calm. You were only under for a few minutes. Izuku's mind reeled. It had felt like a lifetime. He looked down at the Asachi resting in his lap. It looked the same, a simple, black, nameless sword. But it felt different. The cold, alien weight was gone, replaced by a faint, steady warmth that pulsed in time with his own heartbeat. It was no longer just a tool. It was a partner. He knew it now. He knew them. He slowly, reverently, picked up the sword. He looked at Kenshin, his green eyes still shimmering with unshed tears, now holding a new depth, a new, unshakable certainty. He opened his mouth and spoke the name that now echoed in the deepest parts of his soul, his voice a quiet whisper that filled the entire warehouse with its newfound weight. Ayu no Hashira. The days following Izuku's communion with his Zanpakuto spirit were a study in frustrating subtlety. Knowing the name, Ayu no Hashira, was one thing. Convincing it to manifest its power was another entirely. The sword felt different in his hands now, a low, steady hum of energy resonating from the steel that he could feel even through the cloth-wrapped hilt. It was a partnership, but a quiet one. The armored figure and the chorus of vestiges had given him their name, but the key to unlocking their power, the release command, remained elusive. It's a conversation, Kenshin explained during one of their late-night training sessions in the now familiar warehouse. He paced the concrete floor, his boots crunching on loose debris. Shirkai is an agreement between a Soul Reaper and the Zanpakuto. The release command is the word that seals that agreement. It has to be something that resonates with the core nature of both your soul and the spirits. It's not a magic password you guess. It's a statement of purpose. Izuku sat on a crate, his notebook open on his lap, the Asachi leaning against his leg. He had filled pages with potential commands, approaching the problem with his usual analytical fervor. Stand, Ayu no Hashira! Protect, Ayu no Hashira! Endure, Ayu no Hashira! He had tried them all, shouting them at the top of his lungs until his throat was raw, pouring his will into the blade. Nothing happened. The sword remained a simple, black katana. His control over his raw Riryoku had improved. His meticulous, systematic approach had allowed him to cast a wobbly but functional Bakudo for Hainawa, but the true release of his power remained locked away. Maybe you're overthinking it, Kenshin said, stopping his pacing to look at Izuku. You're trying to find a word that fits the spirit's identity. But the release command isn't just about the sword, it's about you. What do you want it to do? When you call its name, what is the single, fundamental action you are asking of it? Izuku frowned, tapping his pen against the notebook. What was he asking of it? He thought back to the vision in his inner world. The pillar. The promise he had made. It wasn't just about standing or protecting, it was more active than enduring. It was about shouldering a burden. About providing a foundation for others. He scribbled a new word in his notebook. Support. Before he could explore the thought further, a sudden, piercing wail cut through the night. It wasn't a sound that traveled through the air, but a psychic shriek that vibrated directly in their souls. It was a familiar sound to Kenshin, one that signaled a profound violation of the natural order. The air in the warehouse grew heavy, the pressure dropping as if a storm front had rolled in. A deep, guttural moan, like the sound of a great whale dying, echoed from the direction of the city center. Kenshin's head snapped up, his weary eyes wide with alarm. "No," he breathed, his voice tight. "That sound, that pressure." Izuku was already on his feet, his hand instinctively gripping the hilt of his Asachi. He felt it too. A presence so vast, so alien, it made the tyrant hollow he'd fought feel like a common insect. This was a spiritual black hole, a vortex of negative energy that was sucking the very life out of the air. "What is that?" Izuku asked, his heart hammering against his ribs. "A Minos Grande," Kenshin said, his face pale. "Jillian class. The lowest order of Minos, but still, they're not supposed to appear in the world of the living unless the spiritual balance is critically unstable. They're walking natural disasters. They don't just hunt individual souls, they consume everything." He rushed to the hole Izuku had blasted in the warehouse wall weeks ago, peering out toward the distant city lights. Izuku followed, his eyes tracing Kenshin's gaze. In the heart of the city, a tear in reality was yawning open. It was not the jagged, angry fissure that had birthed the tyrant hollow. This was a smooth, perfectly black circle, a void that seemed to absorb the light of the surrounding skyscrapers. And from that void, a figure was emerging. It was impossibly tall, a giant cloaked in a black shroud that seemed to be woven from solidified night. It moved with a terrifying, glacial slowness. Its feet were long and pointed, like stilts, and its hands were massive, with unnaturally long, white fingers. But its face was the most horrifying part. It was a long, pointed mask of pristine white bone, like the beak of some abyssal bird, with a single, mournful-looking eye slit from which no light emerged. "We have to go," Kenshin said, his voice a low, urgent growl. "The on-duty Soul Reaper for this district won't be nearly enough to handle that thing. It will take a captain-level combatant, and by the time the Siriidi sends one, half the city will be gone." "But what can we do?" Izuku asked, the sheer scale of the creature making his own newfound power feel insignificant. "I couldn't even beat you in a sparring match this morning." "We're not going to beat it," Kenshin said grimly, turning to face him. His eyes, for all his powerlessness, burned with the unyielding fire of a commander. "We're going to buy time. We're going to distract it. We're going to keep it from using its most destructive ability for as long as we possibly can. Now let's move." Kenshin might have been trapped in a human body, but he still knew the city's spiritual pathways, the ley lines that Soul Reapers used for swift movement. He led Izuku in a frantic, ground-level approximation of a flash step, a combination of sprinting through deserted alleyways and clambering over fences. Izuku's spiritually enhanced body, now accustomed to the strain of his training, kept pace easily, the Asachi held tightly in his hand. As they got closer, the spiritual pressure became a physical force. It was a crushing weight that made it hard to breathe, a droning hum that vibrated in Izuku's teeth. The air was frigid, and the few pluses that hadn't fled were frozen in place, their forms flickering like dying candle flames. They finally reached the edge of the downtown area, skidding to a halt on a rooftop overlooking a wide, multi-lane boulevard. The scene below was one of pandemonium. Cars were swerving, crashing into each other as drivers panicked, their primitive senses screaming at them about a danger they couldn't see. People were running, though they didn't know what from, their bodies reacting to the soul-crushing presence of the Minos. The giant stood in the middle of the boulevard, its shrouded form dwarfing the traffic lights. It paid no heed to the chaos of the living world. It was a force of nature, and the scurrying mortals below were no more significant than ants. It moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, its head tilting as if it were listening for something. "It's an amalgamation of hundreds of hollows," Kenshin explained, his voice tight as he kept low behind a ventilation unit. "They have no individual intelligence. They are driven by a singular, all-consuming hunger. It's searching for souls with high spiritual pressure to devour." As if on cue, the Minos stopped. It slowly bent its towering form, its beaked mask lowering until it was pointed directly at a small, overturned car. Izuku could see a family inside, a father, a mother, and a small child in a car seat, all unconscious from the crash but spiritually bright, their terrified souls shining like beacons in the oppressive darkness. The Minos opened its mouth. It was not a mouth of flesh, but a gaping, square-shaped maw that unfolded from its mask. A low, ominous hum began to build, and a sphere of crackling, crimson energy started to coalesce within the opening. "A Ciro," Kenshin hissed, his eyes wide with horror. Damn it, we're too late! That blast will vaporize them and half the city block with them. Time seemed to slow down for Izuku. He saw the terrified, flickering souls of the family. He saw the crimson sphere of doom growing in the monster's mouth. He saw the absolute helplessness on Kenshin's face. All the training, all the analysis, all the fear and doubt, it all boiled down to this single moment. A choice. The same choice he had made in the alley. The same choice he had affirmed in the depths of his own soul. His mind went quiet. The storm ceased. There was only a single, crystalline thought. I have to support them. He didn't know if he was strong enough. He didn't know if he could win. He didn't even know if he could survive. But he knew, with an absolute certainty that transcended logic, that he could not stand by and watch. He could not allow that family to be erased. He was the only one who could stand in the way. He had to be the pillar. He stepped out from behind the ventilation unit, planting his feet on the edge of the rooftop. He held his Asachi in front of him, the simple black blade a stark contrast to the growing crimson apocalypse below. Kid, what are you doing? Get back here! Kenshin yelled, but his voice sounded distant. Izuku wasn't listening. He was having a conversation. Not with his mouth, but with his soul. He poured his will, his fear, his desperate resolve, everything he was, into the sword in his hands. He felt the spirit within the blade respond, the steady hum rising to a powerful, resonant thrum. The chorus of vestiges whispered in the back of his mind, their voices a tide of encouragement. The armored warrior stood at his back, a silent, unshakable presence. He remembered Kenshin's question. What is the single, fundamental action you are asking of it? The answer was simple. It was the word he had written in his notebook, the core of the promise he had made. He raised the sword high, the moonlight glinting off the dark steel. The crimson cirro in the Minos' mouth was reaching its critical point, the sound a high-pitched scream of tearing reality. Izuku took a deep breath and roared, his voice cutting through the unnatural silence, a single, defiant shout against the coming oblivion. Cicero! Yai no Hashira! Support them! Pillar of heroes! The world exploded in a column of brilliant green light. It was not the uncontrolled, chaotic eruption from his first transformation. This was a focused, intentional release. The light surged from his body, engulfing him and the sword. The black Asachi, the simple, nameless blade, began to change. It grew, thickened, reshaped by the raw will of its wielder and the ancient power it contained. When the light receded, the sword was gone. In its place, Izuku held a weapon that was less a blade and more a statement of purpose. It was a massive great sword, a slab of dark, slate-gray steel almost as tall as he was. It had no delicate curve, no fine edge. Its tip was a blunt, squared-off thing, and its width was that of a man's chest. It was not a weapon for dueling. It was a weapon for holding the line. It was a portable wall. A shield that could strike back. Etched into the flat of the blade, glowing with a soft, internal emerald light, was a network of intricate lines, like the load-bearing struts of a massive bridge or the crystalline structure of a diamond. The guard was a simple, heavy rectangle of steel, and the hilt was long enough for a firm, two-handed grip. It was a Zanpakuto born not of aggression, but of unyielding defense. It was a pillar given form. The power that surged through him was immense, but it was no longer a raging inferno. It was a deep, solid, wellspring of strength. It was the calm, unshakable certainty of a mountain. He felt the presence of the vestiges, not just as witnesses, but as a foundation beneath his feet. He was Izuku Midoriya, but he was also the inheritor of 1,000 wills, all united in a single, heroic purpose. The Minos, momentarily distracted by the flare of Shurikai, unleashed its Zero. A massive, crimson beam of pure destructive energy, wide as a bus, shot from its mouth, screaming through the air toward the overturned car. Izuku did not try to meet it with his own blast of energy. That would be a battle of brute force he couldn't be sure he'd win. Instead, acting on an instinct that was both his and not his, he leaped from the roof. He fell the 10 stories in a heartbeat, his black shahakusho fluttering around him, and landed on the street between the Zero and the car, his feet hitting the asphalt with enough force to crack it. He didn't try to cut the Zero. He didn't try to block it. He held his great sword, his pillar, horizontally in front of him. The moment the crimson beam made contact with the flat of the blade, the glowing green lines on the sword flared to life. Instead of exploding, the Zero's energy was caught, absorbed, and then, impossibly, redirected. With a deafening roar, the beam split in two, flowing around the blade like water around a stone in a river. The twin beams shot past Izuku on either side, scoring deep, molten trenches in the boulevard before slamming into the buildings hundreds of yards behind him, resulting in two massive, fiery explosions that were far away from any civilians. The street where Izuku and the family stood was left completely untouched, a small island of calm in a sea of destruction. For a moment, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. The Mino stood frozen, its empty eye slit fixed on the tiny figure who had just defied its ultimate attack. Kenshin, watching from the rooftop, stared with wide, disbelieving eyes. He had seen hundreds of Shirkai releases in his lifetime. He had never seen one that could simply nullify a Minos Class Zero. Izuku stood panting, the strain of the redirection making his arms tremble. The great sword was incredibly heavy, but it was a good weight, a solid weight. He could feel its power, a deep, defensive energy that resonated with his very soul. But he knew defense wasn't enough. The Minos would just fire again. He had to destabilize it. He had to take it down. But how? He couldn't get close enough to strike its mask. It was too tall, and his swordsmanship was still rudimentary. Trying to swing this colossal blade with any finesse was out of the question. Then, an idea sparked in his mind. An idea born of his analytical brain, his obsessive study of heroes, and a flash of inspiration from the inherited battle sense of his new power. The problem with his old power was that the energy just exploded outward from the blade. But this was different. The sword wasn't just a conduit, it was a regulator. The glowing green lines, the struts, they were a distribution network. He couldn't create a focused beam of energy with a swing. But maybe, he didn't have to. All Might, the hero he idolized, could change the weather with a single punch. He focused his power into his fist and released it in a single, explosive instant. What if Izuku could do the same, not just with his own strength, but with the spiritual power of his Zanpakuto? A new technique born of two worlds. He shifted his grip on the great sword, planting its blunt tip firmly on the cracked asphalt in front of him. He placed his left hand on the flat of the blade to steady it, using it as an anchor. He then drew his right arm back, channeling the deep, foundational power of Ayu no Hashira not into the sword, but into his own body. Green energy swirled around his fist, so dense it looked like a miniature galaxy. The Minos, having recovered from its shock, began to form another Zero in its mouth, this one larger and more menacing than the last. Izuku didn't wait. He drove his glowing fist forward, not at the Minos, but at the pommel of his own grounded sword. Delaware. Smash! He roared, the name a tribute to the hero who had inspired him his whole life. The moment his fist impacted the hilt, a catastrophic shockwave of pure, focused Riryoku shot down the length of the blade. The great sword acted as a lightning rod, a focusing lens, driving the entirety of the blow not outward, but downward, directly into the earth. The result was not an explosion. It was an earthquake. The entire boulevard buckled. The asphalt split open as a wave of green spiritual energy ripped through the ground, visible as a fissure of light racing toward the Minos. The ground directly beneath the giant's stilt-like feet heaved upward with tectonic force. The Minos, a creature of the ethereal plane, was fundamentally unstable in the physical world. Its balance was precarious. The violent, localized earthquake completely destroyed its footing. With a mournful, surprised groan, the towering giant lost its balance. It stumbled, its Zero fizzling out as its concentration was broken. It flailed its long, white-fingered hands, trying to right itself, before crashing down onto the street with a world-shaking, soul-jarring impact. It landed on its side, its massive form crushing cars and cracking the foundations of a nearby office building. It was down. Vulnerable. Izuku saw his chance. The fall had brought its beaked, white mask down to a level he could reach. He ripped his sword from the ground, the great sword feeling impossibly light in his surge of adrenaline. He charged, his feet pounding on the broken pavement, his Shihakusho billowing behind him. He leaped onto a crushed bus, using it as a springboard to launch himself into the air. He soared over the Minos' shrouded shoulder, raising the colossal blade over his head for a final, decisive blow. He didn't need a fancy technique. He didn't need another named attack. All he needed was gravity, and the unyielding weight of his will. He brought the great sword down with all his might, a single, two-handed executioner's strike aimed directly at the center of the giant's mask. The slate-gray steel slammed into the pristine white bone. For a moment, there was only the screech of tortured material. Then, a spider web of cracks erupted from the point of impact. The cracks spread, widened, and with a final, deafening crack, the Minos' mask shattered into 1,000 pieces. A piercing, soul-rending shriek of pure agony and release erupted from the creature. Its colossal, shrouded body began to disintegrate, breaking down into countless particles of black and red spiritual energy that dissolved into the night sky, leaving nothing behind but a street torn asunder and a profound, ringing silence. Izuku landed on the ground, his knees buckling from the effort. The massive greatsword in his hands dissolved into green light, reverting to its simple, sealed Asachi form, which clattered from his numb fingers onto the pavement. The deep, foundational power receded, leaving him feeling drained, exhausted, but also exhilarated. He had done it. He had faced an impossible foe, unlocked his power, and saved the day. He had been a hero. He stood there, panting in the middle of the wreckage, a small, solitary figure in black. He was so focused on the fading particles of the Minos that he didn't notice the new presence until it was too late. A flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. A sudden, sharp spike of a new, highly controlled spiritual pressure. A voice, cold and laced with condescending authority, spoke from the shadows of a nearby building. Well, what do we have here? Izuku spun around, raising his Asachi defensively. Two figures emerged from the alley. One was a large, powerfully built man with a comical topknot, wearing the standard Soul Reaper uniform but with an ostentatious, leopard print armband. The other was shorter, leaner, with sharp, severe features and eyes as cold and hard as chips of obsidian. He moved with a liquid grace that spoke of intense training, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his own Zanpakuto. He wore no rank insignia, but his calm, dangerous aura was unmistakable. An illegal power transfer. A human wielding a Zanpakuto. And an unauthorized engagement with a Minos Grande, the severe-looking man said, his voice a low, menacing purr. He took a step forward, his cold eyes sweeping over Izuku, the shattered street, and finally landing on Kenshin, who had just dropped down from the rooftop. Captain Kenshin Tatsuya, the captain commander sends his regards. You and the specimen are under arrest. You will be returned to the Siriidii for judgment and execution.